Good morning, everyone. For those in the viewing audience, as you heard Aaron Bryson just mentioned from the Canadian Agricultural Human Resources Council, that we are going to be just waiting for a couple, about probably 30 more seconds, and then we'll get started here. And today's topic is actually going to be on composting. So, working with Mother Earth. While we're waiting to get started here, I want to invite our online participants to use the chat and let us know who's there, your name, where you're from, and if you would like to do an land acknowledgement as well of whose First Nations territory you are living in, or if you're a First Nation person, let us know that as well. Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Beverly O'Neill. I'm a citizen of the Tanaha Nation and grateful to be on the unceded lands and of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people in what is known today as the Vancouver area. So I will be your moderator today. Really happy so many people could join us. I'm going to do a quick round of introductions here. You are joining the Canadian Agriculture Human Resources Council Indigenous How-To series itself. For those of you who are in the viewing audience, I'd like to invite you to share with the rest of us who is there through the chat, your name, where you're from, and if you'd like to share what First Nations territory you're in, please do so itself. Just a quick little features here for this Zoom webinar feature. In the Zoom webinar, it just enables a viewing audience to see who are identified as panelists and speakers in the session. So you won't see your name or who else is on the session. I think that you may be you will, if you put your name in chat, you'll see who's there. If you look in the bottom of your screen, the icons that appear, there's one that says Q&A. Feel free to add any questions in the Q&A, and we'll be viewing those throughout. Sonny Gray is our guest speaker today, and Sonny is the CEO of Northstar Agriculture. He's going to be speaking on composting. And after he shares his overview, this is a how-to session. We're going to provide an opportunity for people to ask questions. So again, you can share them in Q&A, and then you can also use that raise hand feature as well. So that is good. And just a quick little bit here on our PowerPoint. Let me bring that up. We will be using a PowerPoint, so hopefully everyone has access to the internet or access to a screen itself, because Sonny has a PowerPoint presentation. Sonny does have a PowerPoint presentation here. Just bring up the right one. And as I mentioned, this is the Canadian Agriculture Human Resources Council, and we are today with the National Indigenous Agriculture and Food Sharing Circles. These sessions, we're doing our how-to sessions. Last year, if any of you joined us, we actually did speaker series. So a number of Indigenous people and Indigenous initiatives across Canada sharing some of the agriculture initiatives that they were doing. We invited people in last year's sessions to share with us your ideas or interest in a future how-to series. So these are the results of your comments itself. I want to introduce some of the people that are here with us today. As we do in our speaker series, is we also invite an Indigenous initiative or organization to be our co-host. So today's session is the National Indigenous Agriculture Association with President Dale Warm. Dale, give everybody a wave. Dave, wave. And we've got Ken Bear. He's on, there we go. We've got Ken and he's in his car, not driving. So that's great, Ken. And of course, one of the most important people here is Jennifer Wright. She is the acting executive director of the Canadian Agriculture Human Resources Session. Jennifer, I'll let you introduce yourself here in a moment. A couple key points. So as today's session is being recorded, all of them are, so that what Canadian Agriculture Human Resources Council will be doing is they will be editing these videos and then hosting them on the CAHRC website. They will be posted after all of the speaker series is completed itself. And for those of you that have registered, if you stay to the end, we will also be doing a draw. So you must be in attendance to win. So if you're not in attendance and your name draws and we don't hear or notice that you are there, then we will be moving, we will redraw. We'll also be sending a link to a post-session survey. So at the end of the session, I'll mention when our next sessions are and what they are covering. So Jennifer, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Thanks so much, Beverly, and welcome everyone to the first in this fall's series of Sharing Circles. Thank you very much for your attendance. As Beverly mentioned, I'm the Acting Executive Director with the Canadian Agricultural Human Resource Council. If you haven't heard of our organization before, we're a national nonprofit organization. All of our work is focused on industry-led initiatives. We do a lot of labor market research. We also do a lot of work to develop and provide solutions to the agriculture industry as a whole across Canada. So very pleased to have everyone with us today. As Beverly also mentioned, this is another set or another series of the Sharing Circles. I will include in the chat a link to the Sharing Circles that took place last fall, just so you have that as a reference, and you might want to go back and take a look at some of the content that was covered back then. And looking forward to the conversation today and looking to learn a little bit as well. So thanks so much and enjoy the session.
Thank you, Jennifer. Another person that's incredibly important to recognize is Aaron Bryson. He is a person many of you have been communicating with. He's the one that sets up the systems and keeps all of the technology going. And he's also very important because he's the one that makes sure your name gets in the draw. So everyone be nice to Aaron. Just a quick recognition of some of the people on session today. And again, feel free, if you haven't yet done so, add your name to it. JL Port, welcome from the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation. Halsey Sai from joining us from Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Oji-Cree, and the homeland of the Métis Nations. Dustin and Marianne, glad you could join us. Angie, to Heather Charles, who's joining from the Chippewas, Leah Cole, welcome, Jennifer Bullade, Lisa Setti, thank you for joining us, Mary Ann, and we'll continue to recognize people throughout. Again, a reminder, feel free to add your name into the chat session and any questions you have for the speaker or even for Jennifer, CAHRC, or Dale and Ken. Feel free to ask questions in the Q&A. They'll be monitoring it throughout the presentation, and we'll be bringing up questions at the end as well. So I'm now going to turn it over to our guest speaker, Sonny Gray, the CEO of Northstar Agriculture. Sonny.
Perfect. Well, thank you all for having me. I'm currently at home, so I'm up in the Yukon on the traditional territory of the Kwanlin First Nation and the Tonquitchin Council. This is a topic that's always really exciting to chat about. I've got this slide presentation, but obviously it could be much bigger. There's composting is a pretty complex affair. If you go down that road, it can be as simple or as complex as you want it to be. The primary slide here is the introduction slide, compost. You can see they've built these 2 bins. These are pretty common structures that you can put them together at home with pallets. You see that quite often as well. And basically, these bins is for transferring. You can transfer from one to the other, and I'll explain that further as we continue. If we can get the next slide up, we'll jump right in. So compost, what is composting? And this is a really basic definition. It's obviously the process of breaking down organic material like food scraps or leaves and animal byproducts. And once successful, the result is a nutrient-rich, dirt-like material that's really full of nutrients and can be used to enrich soil and nourish growth. So you'll see it being implemented typically on gardens, market gardens, and if you've got a large enough setup, that you can be spreading it on your fields as well to increase your soil content. Next slide. All right, here's where we dive right in. So composting basics, what's in it? You can compost a combination. What you're looking for is thirds of each of these things. So you're looking for a third of green carbon, which is your grass clippings. You say weeds pre-seed, but you know what? Even if they go to seed, if you've got chickens in your little farm setup, you throw those weeds in with the chickens and they'll eat all the seed off of it and then pick it up after the fact. It'll be inoculated with nitrogen because chickens have a high concentrated nitrogen poop. Vegetable scraps and food waste. So obviously everybody has some of these things. Brown carbon, you're going to have shredded cardboard, and it's important obviously to have a cardboard that's like a brown cardboard that doesn't have a shiny surface on it, doesn't have any tape or staples. Straw, dry leaves, wood chips and sawdust. And of course, when you're looking for wood chips and sawdust, you're looking for a balance of maybe softwood, hardwood. Nitrogen. So comfrey is a I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with that. It's a plant that you can grow. I'm growing it here up in the Yukon. So if I can grow it here, you guys can grow it there. Coffee grounds are very high in nitrogen. Nettles, same thing, very high in nitrogen. And of course, animal waste, animal manure is very high in nitrogen. You'll see here they've got a little section that says don't compost. So animal fats or dog or cat feces. Dairy products and meat scraps or bones, diseased plants or weeds that go to seed. Now, I mean, the further you go down the road of compost, the more complicated you get into compost. These things that you don't compost, you could actually potentially compost. But for now, we're just saying, hey, I'm treating everyone as an introduction, and I'm assuming that some of you might have a compost pile or are thinking about getting into it. So let's keep things simple. But you can get really complex with this stuff. The next slide, I think we'll talk about what are the requirements for success. So these are really the 4 main things that you require for success when you're composting. You need air circulation. Getting oxygen into the center of your pile is really necessary. It ensures that breakdown of organic material. Moisture, water is required to help speed up your decomposition process. If the pile is too dry, it's not decomposing. As well as it's used for regulating the compost's temperature. Heat provides an environment that encourages good bacteria to thrive, and it kills seeds and it destroys pathogens. you can get heat, that's what your nitrogen is. When you add nitrogen to your pile, that's what typically kickstarts your heat. And we'll go into further detail of these. This is just a quick overview. Pile rotation is important as well. And that's why I was talking in the very first slide about rotation with those 2 bins. Regular pile rotation really encourages oxygen, which is important to complete the composting. And it also helps control odors. So if you've had, I'm really curious to see after this is done, those of you who have had experience composting, what were your bad experiences? And hopefully some of the stuff in this will clear up, what those bad experiences were and how to mitigate them and ensure that we don't reproduce them. On the next slide, we're going to talk about let's turn up the heat. So you can see this pile back here, just steaming. And what you want is the center of your piles to reach, 45 to 55 degrees Celsius for usually up to 3 days is what you're shooting for. And that's to kill pathogens and viruses. Now your pile could get even hotter, but you really don't want it to get hotter because that same heat that kills your pathogens and viruses could potentially, kill your bacteria. And the bacteria, if you think of a compost pile as this little city, you've got all these bacteria and all these different, moving parts in there that are living things that are busy breaking down that compost for you, breaking down that organic material. You want to give them the best, weather possible. So you want it to be just the right amount of heat, just the right amount of humidity, just the right amount of oxygen. And all these things are, things that you're going to dial in as you get better and better working with compost. But without the heat, your entire process slows right down. It means that your piles, if you've tried this and you didn't do anything, you just threw a bunch of organic content in a pile, it could take over a year before actually becoming soil and contributing to your gardens. And that's the difference, I guess, between aerobic and anaerobic composting. The right amount of heat, promotes the growth of both mesophilic and thermophilic bacteria, and they come in waves. You'll have one and then the other. These bacteria help break down that organic waste, like I was describing in that scenario of a little city with all these bacteria living in there. So when you first get started, let that pile sit for 3 or 4 days. You can get a thermometer. It's like a long thermometer. I don't know. It's probably about 1.5 feet, 2 feet long. And you can stick that right in the middle of your pile, and that'll tell you, where your heat's at. And we say 3 to 4 days because if your heat hasn't reached, that 45 to 55, you just let it sit a little longer until it does. If it has reached that, then, time to turn your pile. So allow that heat to build up first, and that's just sets the tone, gets those bacteria kicked in, and then off you go. So once you've achieved the right heat, turn that pile. Typically every 2 days. If you're looking for soil production, if you want to get that compost into your garden ASAP, that's the typical method of doing it. Let it sit 3-4 days, turn every 2 days, and we'll go over the rest at the next slide. Air circulation is, go with the flow. Air circulation, we need air flow, because those microorganisms, if they don't have that air flow, then they don't have the required conditions to thrive. And then they won't be there to help in that decomposition process. And it'll slow everything right down. So just like the heat, without, air circulation, your entire process, comes to a grinding halt. And your pile could take over a year before contributing to your garden again. You can see in this one here that they've got these drilled pipes. They just slid them in through the slats. You could do that if you were doing if you were building bins out of pallets, which are really accessible. Everybody's got pallets. And then, you're just layering your material on top of that, and then it's able to have that air circulation. That also aids in decreasing gases. Composting, anytime you have anything that's decomposing, there's gases being produced. So, CO2, methane, these are all gases that at some point in time are part of the pile. And so having that air circulation, that just helps decrease that. Now, the opposite can happen. Once again, I talk about that balancing act. Don't dry it out. Too much air circulation has the potential to dry your compost pile right out. Make sure you take a balanced approach and test what works best for your pile. And that'll basically, the materials that you add to the pile will dictate just how much air circulation you require. And like I said, you're gonna try it. You're gonna see, oh, that didn't work. Okay, just keep testing things until you feel like you've dialed it in. It's a process, it's a journey, and it's a lot of fun once you've got the gist of it. Next slide, we'll talk about let's dig into pile rotation, right? So you got to keep on moving. You got to turn that pile regularly. Now, ideally, like I said, you've got every 2 days after you achieve that heat. So you're flipping that material from one bay to another is the best approach, because you're basically taking the top of the heat, putting it on the bottom, taking the bottom and moving it to the top. Without the rotation, same as the air, same as the previous slides, your entire process slows right down. If you've got a pile of organic matter in the backyard that hasn't done much of anything, it's probably because you haven't done some of these items. Now, you can remove your air pipes as you rotate and then add them to the new pile. That's what's really nice about that little setup. You can literally just slide it over and start piling and then add new ones as you go. But really observe as you're doing this, how much moisture you have in the materials. So it's a good time to add moisture if you're flipping, or add drier materials as necessary. So if you're grabbing a handful of that stuff and you're squeezing it and you're getting maybe 1 or 2 drops of moisture out of the bottom of your fist, yeah, that's perfect. You got the right amount of moisture. If you're flipping it and it's like soup, or it's like just dried leaves and you can almost see the dust coming off of it, guess what? You're gonna need to add water, or you're gonna need drier materials. And instead of taking, because roughly you can make soil in roughly 18 to 20 days, if you've got it dialed in. If you're turning your pile for the first time and you realize, oh, too much water, oh, need drier materials, add 2 days to your cycle, basically. Let's jump to the next slide, and that one there will be just further detail about moisture. So keeping things moist, and I know a lot of people hate that word, that's why I put it there. Finding that perfect balance. Too much water is going to slow down your process. You're going to have a pool of water coming out of your compost. It's going to stink. Too little water also can slow things down. Like I said before, if you can squeeze a few drops out by hand, perfect. You've got it dialed in. That's exactly where you want to be. Now, if it's too dry, too wet, same deal. Entire process slows right down. Add 2 days between your next rotation. Now, too much air circulation. Oh, look at that. I guess we've got a duplicate on that one. Oh, well. Well, you get the gist anyways, that water at the end of the day is necessary, but it's part of that balancing act. You're going to need to make sure that you have just the right amount of water. And that's pretty crucial. Now, next slide, we're going to talk about, because that's the approach. Now, here's some different ways of doing it. So I said, we looked at the bins in the very first slide. Now we're looking at some of the piles. So some of the different styles of pile. These ones here, 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. That's pretty standard. Pile like that, it doesn't have any sides or anything. You can just kind of toss it in there. These windrows is when you're really getting into it. If you're like, okay, we've got a lot of compost material. Say your community decides to take on a compost program of food waste, and you've got piles of wood chips sitting there, and you've got a barn with a bunch of manure coming out of it. You're in a really good condition, I think, to go ahead and take your composting to a much more commercial scale, and that's windrows. And this is just a quick, showcase of what that looks like. They just do it in large piles. You can get an attachment that goes on the side of your tractor that's offset, that actually has like an auger on it, and it'll actually flip and rotate your piles as you drive by. So it's pretty sweet setup if you're doing it on that scale. Now, if you're just doing it for your market garden or your greenhouse, your community greenhouse, then chances are you just need to do the bin method or a pile method and leave the windrows to the real keeners. Next slide. We look at complementary compost builders. Now, these subjects are subjects in themselves, obviously. Part number one, I talk about vermiculture, vermicomposting, worm farming, as they call it. Worms, like bacteria, they speed up the decomposition process of the organic matter. They dig, they aerate as well. They run little tunnels, and that creates space in there for air to flow. And they eat stuff, and their byproduct, their poop, is worm castings, which is really good stuff. You see a lot of people using worm castings. It's kind of like black gold. They'll add it where they really need to add it, and kind of stockpile it and keep it for later. But you can either do the vermicomposting as a separate thing, or you can add worms to your compost pile. Now, remember that heat that we talk about, right? Obviously, too hot, you're going to kill all your worms. Worms are pretty smart, though. Like, if the heat's slowly rising, it's too hot, get out of the kitchen. That's what they're doing. They're getting out. They're moving to the sides of the pile where it's not as hot. And that's one complementary compost builder. The next slide, we have a second one. That is kind of its own thing. I mean, in itself, compost tea is a liquid version of your solid compost material. There's a variety of recipes. You can go online and you can see all the different types of recipes. When you start to understand what, food waste is a really good example. So say we're using food waste, start understanding what food waste has what nutrients. Makes it easier to start to brew some of this compost tea stuff. And compost tea, once you've done it, see, this guy's doing it in 5-gallon pails. So once you've taken, say you were taking, say you want a potassium, you can take all those waste banana peels and you just throw them in a bucket of water like that and let it sit for 2 weeks. Now the liquid that you have after the fact is going to be very high in potassium. In fact, it'll basically be so high that you wouldn't be able to just pour that on your plants. It's concentrated. So you'd only take a couple of spoonfuls and add it to maybe a spray bottle, and then you'd spray it. Our company is actually doing some research. We got a MyTax application in, and it was approved. And we're doing research to see how we can use compost tea in hydroponic systems to basically offset the nutrient costs and the chemical nutrients that we have to purchase in case there was a situation where there was a problem with getting nutrients from down south. Then at least you'd have a kind of an alternative for those hydroponics systems. So obviously compost tea that can be used in conjunction with regular composting. I like to put my eggshells, my banana peels, my coffee grounds in kind of different containers, and then I build out these little 5-gallon pails of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, etc., depending on what I'm putting in, calcium, etc. So that's another example of a complementary compost builder. Next, we have troubleshooting. So like I said, chances are you've given us a shot, or somebody that has. And so here's some of the things that you might run into, and you're like, why is it doing this and why isn't it doing that? So materials, are your materials present in the required ratios? You remember in the very beginning, and I know I'm going through this quickly, but we talked about green carbon, brown carbon, nitrogen, and a third. That's an important ratio to have. You need to make sure you maintain that ratio and that you layer that stuff in. But you got to check, like, are they clumping up? The one that does this a lot is grass clippings. It's got this humidity to it. And then when it gets inside that, if you haven't broken it up appropriately, it'll go, I'm sure you've seen it. It'll go like a yellow, and it'll go kind of sludgy if there's a lot of moisture. If there is no moisture, it'll go so dry that it starts to mold up. You get like white in there. And so you got to break up and aerate those materials every time you're flipping that compost pile, and make sure you're breaking it up. Undesirables, did you add any undesirable materials by accident to the pile? Is there meat or fish or dairy or grease? If so, remove those items. That's what's stinking up your pile right now. I say that now, I've seen people use slaughter waste. I mean, we've done it even, slaughter waste, so fish waste or meat, as a Kickstarter because of the nitrogen quantity. So if you haven't got access to manure right now, and you need to just get that pile heated up in the very beginning, you dig a hole in the center and maybe throw some fish guts in there, boom, off you go, you're off to the races. But typically, in large quantities, you don't want that stuff in your pile. It's what really creates that smell. And it's an attractant, at the end of the day. A lot of us live in areas where, you're going to end up with, here in the Yukon, it's bears. Down south, I suspect you're going to have, raccoons and skunks and all kinds of other stuff digging through your piles. So important, obviously, to mitigate that. Now, a cold pile. Yeah, and this is always disappointing, when you get started, you're like, why is it just sitting there? It's not doing what it needs to do. So there's no heat. Have you added enough high nitrogen content? That manure, like I said, those plants, comfrey and nettles. And here I mentioned the slaughter offal as well. So, you got that piece of roadkill that you found on the side of the road, throw it in the middle of your pile and get that heat going. Do you need help? Because I think a lot of us in the very beginning, when we start doing this sort of stuff, we just become overwhelmed. There's just so much information. There's so many different techniques. Everybody thinks their technique is the best technique. The internet, library, bookstores, they're all full of information on composting. Everybody's got a book on composting. And then of course, if you're really stuck, reach out. I'll provide my email address, and I'm always willing to help people out. In fact, that's how I've learned what I've learned about composting is mentorship. I've managed to work with people that are really good at what they do. And then between that and reading a ton of books and actually getting my hands dirty and building compost piles, that's really, the key. Next. Okay, so full disclosure, obviously this topic is a really exciting one for me to present and explore. There's a variety of potential benefits that could be stacked with compost generation, including heat capture, biogas production, CO2 generation for boosting plant production. Before I jump to questions, I'll share just a few stories of what that looks like. Your pile with that heat that it's generating, there's a potential there for heat capture. We've done some experiments with cement bins instead of having pallets and stuff in there with water or glycol, and able with a little circ pump to get it to move, and then you can run that into your little greenhouse and you can heat your greenhouse for those shoulder months. Biogas production, when we talked about the methane production, methane in a lot of places is really useful for heating things, or I know in Africa, where I'm headed to Africa here in a few weeks, and I was looking at it, and they've got biogas production where they basically use it to run their stoves. It's kind of similar, I guess, to natural gas here in North America. CO2 generation. So this is an interesting one. There's a story that I read about a guy who, he was piling his compost up against the side of his greenhouse. He liked to do that because it was generating heat, and it kind of heated the plastic, and then it transferred inside. So he was kind of capturing a little bit of that heat. But every time he went in there to flip it, he was using his tractor and the tines and the forks. Sometimes they punched through the side of the greenhouse when he was flipping it. He walked into his greenhouse one day and he realized that one side of his greenhouse was producing way higher than the other side. Like, it was obvious. So the height of the plants and so on and so forth was just higher on one side. And, he kind of stared at it for a little while, trying to figure out, like, why is that? And then he realized that that was the side the compost was on. So obviously there was some heat, but those holes that he had punched through, they allowed CO2 to leach into the greenhouse on that side. And those plants, they loved that stuff. They were grabbing it and they were using it to grow faster and bigger. So you know, these types of things, I'm trained in permaculture as a design and planning consultant, but I like to look at these types of stacking of benefits when you're talking about compost. Now I'll do less talking, and I'll let people ask questions if there are any.
Great, thank you, Sonny. Before we get into the group questions, just wanted to ask you two questions itself. Is there a difference between food recycling and composting? And secondly, what about the food recyclers that you can buy for your in-home production?
So yeah, food waste. I mean, the thing about food waste that's interesting is that there are layers, right? If you say, for example, if you're getting food waste from the grocery store, there's a program there that they call Loop. I don't know if you guys have heard of it, but you can take that, and as a farmer, you can go and you can access that program. You can grab that waste food, and then you can take it and potentially feed it to your livestock. There's a gap there. I know that some places are picking it up. They're processing the good stuff because it's you know, it's not all bad. And so they'll pickle it, or they'll run it through a dehydrator or whatever, make salsa out of the stuff, and then whatever's left over, that goes to your food waste. So that could be to your livestock as well, or it can go to your compost. But you don't want to just have a compost of food waste. It's not going to go anywhere. It needs, there are, like I said, those three third portions of it: that dry, the brown carbon, the green carbon, and your nitrogen. Those are requirements, you know, so you have to have a balancing act. If you just throw a bunch of one thing into a pile, it's just going to be a mess. That was the first question. What was the second question?
The second question was on those in-home food recyclers.
Yeah, so I've used that in the past because I didn't when I first came to the Yukon, I didn't have a lot of money, and I just lived in an apartment with my brother, but I recognized that we had food waste, and I grew up farming, grew up gardening, and I wanted to, capture that. So we had this little composter, like a countertop sort of thing. Worked really well. It just essentially what it did was dry stuff up. There was enough heat in that unit to dry it up, and it'd chop it up as it was going. And then when you were done, you had a pretty good dry kind of organic matter that you could definitely add to your compost pile, or you could definitely just dig a hole in your garden and throw it in there.
Great, thanks, Sonny. By the way, Sonny, do you need to have a specific machine, or can you make one?
To flip your
compost,
compost,
your home.
you mean?
Well, for home.
Oh, for your home. Yeah, ideally you'd buy one. They're not that expensive. They're starting to, people recognize now that recycling, composting is a thing. And so you can get countertop versions of kind of little home composters that you can use in your home for sure.
Great. Thank you, Sonny. I'm going to go over to the questions here. The first one we had, though, was if you've missed some of the information that Sonny shared with us, then two things. One, the session is being recorded, and it will be available on the Canadian Agriculture Human Resources Council website after all of the sessions are done. And if you want to see what the speaker series was last year, those sessions are already up, so you can look online there. So Sonny was also one of our guest speakers last year. And then we've got a couple sessions here, questions here from Lisa. She's new to vermiculture, bed of fruit flies. And question is, can worms be added to a compost pile in the fall? And the gardener asking me for worms assures me their pile will not freeze, but I worry. And also their pee can be used, right?
Yeah. So yeah, no, vermicomposting is a lot of fun. I really enjoy that because of the worms. I mean, that's the best part for me. They're just, but yes, fruit flies are a pain in the butt. But yeah, I think you're doing the right thing. If you're chopping things up smaller, layering stuff like newspaper or whatever in there also helps. Now, yeah, so adding worms to the compost pile in the fall. I guess the big one for me is, are they turning it during the winter, or is it just going to sit? I mean, so in the Yukon where, things freeze up during winter pretty solid, I've seen worms survive in the soil in the Yukon. But the trick is that there was large amounts of organic material in that soil. So it was like maybe a foot of organic content, which in the Yukon is really rare. Typically we're running 6 inches to 8 inches of organic material, but this was a farm where the people had been, living there for 30 plus years. They'd been adding manure and compost to their soil, and they'd built it up to, a foot and a half. So worms were living in there all year round. That wasn't a problem. But a compost pile, if they're not, if they're flipping it, if they're keeping that heat going, if it's a big pile where the heat got quite hot and now it's sitting there for the winter and it's covered up, shouldn't be an issue. But there's always that chance that something goes sideways and their pile slowly, just freezes up. Too much moisture, that could be an issue. But usually if it was me, I'd put the worms in the spring. I'd just start a new pile and get things going, get that heat out of the way, and then toss those worms in after the fact. And yes, their pee can be used as well. You can use the castings to do a compost tea in itself. That's also has lots of nutrient value.
Just to confirm, I'm pretty certain you answered correctly with they asked what pea can be used. You meant the worms and not the gardeners.
Yeah, although human pee, you can use that in your gardens too. It's got everything you need in terms of NPK. Like, it's. I know a lot of people don't go down that road. I wasn't going to, but here we are.
well, rice fields.
Well, human urine is actually very good for compost. It's
excellent. Good. Great. Thank you for that question, Lisa. Jordan has a question. Jordan has a question as well. And it's, what's the length of composting season where you live in the Yukon, and do you continue turning? I think you kind of answered this one, but a little bit about seasonal composting. And I know we've got a few people from the north, and if there's any other comments or suggestions here on a national or other parts of Canada, including Atlantic Canada.
Yeah, I mean, it really, a lot of it has to do with the amount of compost material you're producing. So if you've got, if you're cleaning the barn regularly, if you've got lots of food waste, if you've got wood chips and your, piles of wood chip that's sitting tarped, waiting to go into the compost, if you have those materials present, then yeah, we'll continue composting over the winter, because with that heat, you'll get a bit of ice on the top, maybe the first couple of inches, it's going to freeze up a little bit. But your compost is covered. You've got a tin roof over it or a tarp over it or something. And that heat that the center of that pile is generating, typically keeps it pretty good to go. You're going in there with, a small tractor or something and a set of forks or whatever, and you're flipping it. You'll see the steam just coming out of that thing. And then you're building into that same pile, just trying to maintain that heat and keep it going. Now, if you are going on a smaller scale, it's a backyard sort of operation, then yeah, typically, you kind of shut her down for the winter. You're just doing kind of just kind of let it, like you said, freeze over, let it sit there, do its thing. In the spring, you'll just kickstart it again. Like I said, add nitrogen to your pile. You wanted to get that heat back up and going. Go ahead, dig a hole in the center or something and throw in some comfrey or some manure, some straight animal manure right into that pile, and you should be good to go. But it depends on volume ultimately. If you've got the volume, go ahead, keep going all through the winter. If you haven't got the volume, then just let her sit and come back to it in the spring.
You can let the pile sit for a bit, depending on the climate. Now, I mentioned Atlantic Canada, and certainly living here on the wet coast, you've got different moisture. So, any other considerations there? You've mentioned you need to make sure you have the right balance.
Yeah, so the humidity and is definitely something that you have to take into account. So when I say those 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. You'll know right away if you got to kind of supplement your third, if you're depending on your climate, right? If you're in a location where you've just got so much moisture that you're pulling your pile and it's like, geez, I didn't spray this with too much water, what's going on here? Just the air itself has a lot of moisture. Then yeah, you'll layer in more straw or more shredded cardboard or something to soak that up so that it restores the balance. but that's kind of the key, I think, to that is just understanding what those thirds do, and then kind of managing them as you're flipping your pile. Every time you go in there, if you're flipping your pile every 2 days, you've got your finger on the pulse. You know exactly what's happening in that pile. You're like, woof, this is drying out. I need to add more water. Oh, this is too wet. I need to add more, carbon. Where's my heat? I need to add more nitrogen.
So heat very important. So Sonny, you had one image that had pipes coming out of the pile. Is there an optimum size of pipe, or are there conditions that depend on the size?
Yeah, it depends on the size of your pile, and that one pile that I showed you guys, the 3 by 3 by 3, is pretty common. Those pipes, it's literally just for air circulation, so it doesn't have to be like a specific like 4-inch pipe or 3-inch pipe or whatever. Once again, when you start going through your pile, you'll be like, oh man, I added too much air, or oh, I need to add more air. So it'll dictate how many of those things that you add into your pile. Some people don't use them at all. Some people don't put pipes. Some people just dig. They'll actually dig from the top down. They'll take like an auger on their Bobcat or something. They'll just auger in some holes for the air to come down into the pile. That can be done that way as well. There's lots of techniques. Like I said, it gets pretty complicated when you start comparing. Oh, well, this guy does it this way and this guy does it this way. This is just an example, I guess, of how you could be doing it.
So with the soil that comes out of this, is there what is ideal to grow in it?
Oh, you'll use the soil, in your gardens. It's great for anything, right? It's basically organic matter that you're adding onto your gardens to build your soil. One example of how we've used it in the past, we had a property that had been sitting for a long time. We went out there to do some work on it, and we tilled the earth up. It had been sitting for a long time. We tilled the earth up and we put things into piles and rows and how we were going to kind of terraform things. And then then the weeds came, because there's a seed bank, right? Over time, especially when a property's been sitting that long, you've got years of accumulated seed bank. And so when you till that stuff in, like all of a sudden it just explodes and they're everywhere, right? So how we mitigated that was once you till, we covered everything with silage tarps. Okay. And that just didn't allow, it's called occultation. It didn't allow the plants the opportunity, the weeds to grow. It was dark. And then when the time came that we were like, okay, now we want to kick things into gear, we want to start planting. We actually did a no-till approach, in the sense that we put cardboard down on top of the areas, and then we just put compost on top. So now we had some layering, and you just keep doing that. You just keep adding cardboard, keep adding, and that builds up your soil content, and it doesn't allow those weeds to get hold the way they do, because they can be really bad if you just went onto a property the way we did and have to start from scratch. But those tarps are really useful. I don't know if anybody else uses silage tarps to basically keep things under control as you're moving through the garden and you're shutting down portions and starting to back up. But that's an approach that we use, and the compost is our soil. We're literally adding that to the top of the layer of the soil to just continue to build that organic content. And as I talked about with the worms and the fact that if you've got deep enough organic matter, it doesn't matter how cold you're getting, your worms are going to survive.
Okay, thanks, Sonny. We probably have time for one more question from the viewing audience. If you'd like to ask a question on Q&A, please do so. While we're doing that, I just asked one more question, Sonny. Any examples of First Nations doing any community composting?
And not off the top of my head, to be honest. I think there's a huge potential in every community to do it though. And the reason being is because compost programs can be pretty intimidating when you're looking at it on a massive scale, like a full-on town of 10,000 plus people. But communities tend to be smaller. They tend to be anywhere from a couple hundred to 1,000. That's a little more manageable. You can educate people, because obviously picking up food waste and yard waste and so on and so forth, it's an education process for everybody involved in the program. You don't want to put stuff in there, and then you don't want to have to sort it when it gets on site. So we run pilot projects, and that seems to be a really good starting point. It's a launch pad. Once you get people excited about it and understanding it, it's no different, I guess, than the recycling boom that occurred, right? Where now most of us are pretty educated about separating out plastic and all the different grades of paper and everything else. Compost solutions for communities are going to be very similar. I see there's a question here from Dale about a silage tarp. Do we mean a layer of silage? No, it's an actual silage tarp. So it's like this black plastic that they use, I guess, to cover silage when they have them in windrows. They just tarp it and put it over top. The reason we use that specifically is because of the material it's made out of is one reason. It's this black stretchy plastic, but also because of the size. You don't get regular tarps that are big enough really typically to handle in a garden. These silage tarps are huge because of course they're covering windrows of silage. So you can get some really big dimensions that potentially will help you cover off entire quarters of quarter acres of your garden at a time, which is, you're not going to find very many materials that you can use to do that.
Great, thank you, Sonny. I see we've got some comments here on there. Misha, thank you for sharing the Beaver Creek First Nations. They're looking to building a composting program. Marianne Walker mentioned that there are several community greenhouses. They have a great community greenhouse where we do have compost that can be used, if not used in the greenhouse. Lisa Seti reminded everyone there's several composting communities in Manitoba. And JL Port, they have a compost set up at our school on Georgina Island. This is a great example of introducing kids to agriculture and caring for Mother Earth. So thank you guys for sharing those comments on it. And I guess on that note, I guess if we can't get our land back, we can at least start in the meantime in building our land back through creating your own composting. So there's my bad joke for the session, you guys. We are now going to go on to our final activity of the day, and that is Aaron Bryson is going to get to our draws ready. I'm going to mention what our next sessions are, and then I'm going to ask Dale if he can share what the National Indigenous Agriculture Association does. Thank you very much, Sonny. This is great. So right combination, right ingredients. It's like baking a cake. You got to know what each ingredient does, the right temperature. You got to know your climate. You got to know how to mix things in the order and times and how to care for it. So this is, I just love this topic. So thank you very much, Sonny. Our next sessions, by the way, coming up, we have on October 18th, same time, same place, and you can just, if you haven't yet registered, just let Aaron know. He can resend the link. We're going to have Dawn Tababonung speak. She's going to talk about storage, because storage is part of our traditional practices, and in this case, it's about the hominy corn, so which can actually be used for popcorn. November 1st, we've got Dale Worm speaking on greenhousing and community gardens with our co-host of Ulna Wig. November 15th, food labeling, and food that'll go into some food packaging requirements. Trevor Kempthorne with the First Nations Agriculture Association of BC is going to be speaking on that one. And our last session will be on November 29th about beehiving, which many of our First Nations communities are getting involved in. So I'm going to ask Dale Worm if you can take yourself off, put yourself on camera. And while Aaron's getting ready, and of course, reminder to everybody, when Aaron comes back on, we are going to be doing the draws for, we've got cash draws there, and Aaron will mention what they are, and you must be in attendance to win. So Dale, would you like to share a little bit of the National Indigenous Agriculture Association?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, can we get you to start video?
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, so a little bit about National Indigenous Agriculture Association that advocates and assists farmers, primarily those that are farming on reserve. We have board members in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario. Some of the stuff we've done in the past, we give information workshops, 1 or 2 day workshops, where we invite government, various government organizations that work in agriculture to come and talk to the community, to the people that attend the workshops. We've also assisted in mapping lands for some of the First Nations in Saskatchewan. Because of the treaty land entitlement, they've got lands all over the place and they don't even know what they are. So we've done that. And then we've also worked at getting access to finances through Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada programs such as CAHRC. CAHRC stands for Canada Agricultural Loans Act. It's not available on reserve, but it is available off reserve. So we've worked at that, trying to get that going through. And it hasn't been too successful so far. Primarily, it's with the banks, and because of Section 91 of the Indian Act, they're afraid that in the case of a default, that they can't go on reserve and claim or get their whatever they provided to the First Nation farmer on reserve. So that's something that we've done. And we continue to work at that, advocate on that. The other one is finding quota. That's what it takes.
Great, thanks, Dale. Is there any way that people can connect with the National Indigenous Agriculture Association if you have any further questions?
Yes, they can. I'll put my email in the chat.
Great. So Dale's going to add his email in the chat. And Sonny, by the way, if you notice in the chat as well, Sonny has also added his contact information if anyone has any further questions or would like any help. And Jennifer has commented, thanks to Sonny for sharing this great information on composting. Incredibly interesting, and we really appreciate your time. So Jennifer, would you like to make any closing remarks before we go to the draws?
No, just thanks so much for everyone attending. Thanks, as I mentioned in the chat as well, to Sonny for sharing his knowledge on this topic, and to Dale and Ken and the National Indigenous Agriculture Association support for this session. Very much appreciated, and looking forward to the next session.
I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Really great that you were here. Again, we've got sessions coming up on October 18th. I hope you will be joining us on that session for storage itself. Dawn knows a lot of information, and even if you have questions on other types of seed storage, she has been working on that. An amazing, wonderful Indigenous woman with a lot of cultural knowledge as well. And please share the link with others, and because we'd love to make sure that we share this knowledge that people have on it. Thank you very much, Sonny, for sharing your knowledge. Always really great to speak with you.
Thank you for having me. I really had a good time. Enjoyed myself.
Really interesting. And you too, Dale, and always great to be working with Canadian Agriculture Association. And everybody have a really great, safe week. Stay healthy, everyone, and may the Creator send everyone great blessings. Thanks, everyone.